I have tremendous pleasure in moderating this session today, which is titled Towards a Universal Feminism, which I hope is a big enough and imaginative enough and loose enough title to give our panelists and you a lot of scope to interpret it and to speak to it. We have 4 brilliant women here today. Nadje Al-Ali is Professor of Gender Studies at SOAS, University of London. Her publications include What Kind of Liberation? Women and the Occupation of Iraq, Secularism, Gender and the State in the Middle East, the Egyptian Women's Movement, and so on. She's a member of the Feminist Review Collective and an activist. She co-founded ACT Together, Women's Action for Iraq. And currently she's working on several projects with Iraqi female academics and women's rights activists. Now, I'm doing this by, Shaista Aziz, I'm doing it alphabetically, by first name, because I thought, why go for surnames when surnames aren't feminist? So, Shaista Aziz is a former BBC and Al Jazeera journalist, experienced aid worker, stand-up comedian, and writer. She won the King Gong open mic competition at the Comedy Store in Manchester, and since then, this was a year and a half ago, since then she's performed stand-up across the UK and has been invited to perform at the Hong Kong Comedy Festival and the Edinburgh Fringe, and has reached the semi-finals of the Funny Women 2010 competition and final of the Liverpool Comedy Festival 2010 Best Newcomer Awards. She's worked extensively across the Middle East and Pakistan over the past 12 years and has experience of working in Eastern Europe and Russia. She's worked for Amnesty, I should say, so this hasn't been all a stand-up comic tour across Eastern Europe and Russia. No. Okay, Shereen El Feki, over to the far left, is a writer, broadcaster, and academic. She started her professional life in medical science, that was her training, with a doctorate in immunology from Cambridge, before going on to become an award-winning healthcare correspondent with The Economist and a presenter with Al Jazeera English. She is the former vice chair of the United Nations Global Commission on HIV and the Law, as well as a TED Global Fellow. She sits on the board of a number of civil society groups working in the Arab region and contributes to a number of publications, including the Huffington Post, International Affairs, and has written widely on women, sexuality, and HIV in the Arab region. Her roots are in Egypt and in Wales, but she grew up in Canada, and she now lives in both London and Cairo. Her latest book is, her first and latest book is Sex and the Citadel, which is an exploration of sexual behavior in Egypt today. And Victoria Brittain has lived and worked as a journalist in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. She worked at The Guardian for 20 years and has been a consultant to the United Nations on reports on the impact of conflict on women and children. She's a research associate at the London School of Economics and a contributor to various French and American publications. She's on the council of the Institute of Race Relations, a trustee of Widows' Rights International, and a patron of Palestine Solidarity Campaign, and also a founder of the Palestine Festival of Literature, PALFest. Her previous books were mainly on Africa, but in the last 10 years, her work has been principally related to the war on terror. And she's written or co-written 2 plays and 2 books. Her latest one is Shadow Lives, The Forgotten Women of the War on Terror. So, what we thought we would do is I'm going to invite 2 of my colleagues here to talk to us, to give us their presentations for 4 minutes each. I don't know if we've got a stopwatch somewhere. And then, okay, now you're going to have to remind me because I've left my proper papers behind. We've said, I'm sorry, I also had to run over from the Clore Ballroom and I ran over from Cairo yesterday, so forgive me. It's a bit of, so I think that we agreed that Nadje would start, and Victoria would take it over from her, and then we would I would start talking with Shireen, bring her in, and Shaista will end the first section of this panel. And then basically we're going to open the door to you to take the conversation forward. So we will do half and you will do half. Yeah? Okay. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm welcome to all our panelists, starting with Nadje.
Well, thank you, Ahdaf, and thank you all for coming. Well, I'm going to take my 4 minutes to talk on Iraq because it's not only International Women's Day, but we are also marking the 10th anniversary, so to speak, of the invasion of Iraq. And Iraq has become a forgotten story, and certainly the plight of women has become a forgotten story. And I think that when we think about feminism and the relationship between local and global feminism, I think that Iraq shows lots of complexities. On the one hand, I think we really have to challenge the myth that, feminism only sort of exists outside and that the invasion liberated women in Iraq. I mean, Iraq has a very long history of feminism, actually since the turn of the 20th century. And as in many countries in the Middle East, feminism in Iraq was closely associated with independence movements, anti-colonial movements. And actually at some point in the 40s and 50s, the Iraqi Women's League had 40,000 members. I mean, think about a feminist organization in this country with 40,000 members. But then, it was in the run-up to the invasion, there was a strand in global feminism, particularly, of course, in the US, but also in this country, that was sort of complicit in sort of making the argument as part of the wider war on terror, linking, bringing democracy and human rights to the region and liberating its women. But I should also say that there was also a strand of Iraqi women's rights activists who aligned themselves. While, of course, I have many friends in the US who were very much opposed to the invasion, feminist friends. I think it's really important, I mean, that's one of the things that I'd like to stress, is that we move beyond this sort of binary thinking of Western feminism, Middle Eastern feminism. I mean, I think there is, unfortunately, still lots of sort of stereotypes and misconceptions about oppressed Muslim women and, this idea of helping them. But at the same time, I would also say that, of course, locally, there are huge differences when we speak about feminist movements and activists. So, over the last years, there were many Iraqi feminists who would not want to be associated with the occupation, while there were others who felt that, the US and the UK might help them to actually gain women's rights. Unfortunately, we saw that women's rights were the first thing that dropped off the international agenda when it became difficult in Iraq. And so just to say, I mean, the situation right now is really very difficult. I would say that in terms of security, in terms of general everyday lives, in terms of gender-based violence, in many ways, women are actually worse off now than they were 10 years ago, which is very sad.
Thank you, Nadje. So,
well, I also want to say thank you all very much for coming, and I'm really looking forward to your half of the contribution. I'm so familiar with all our work, and I love it, apart from Shireen, whose book I haven't yet read. But it's always good to know what the audience, what their preoccupations and their conceptions of these very complicated issues are. But I want to pick up from Nadje's remarks about Iraq, but also about the complications of putting people in boxes of Western feminists or Middle Eastern feminists, or indeed something completely different. And one of the things that happens to me every time I do a presentation of my book, there's always somebody in the audience who gets up, and often it's a bloke, but it's also sometimes quite annoyed women who say, how can somebody like you be a feminist like you be associating with all these women in veils, which I find obviously incredibly irritating, obviously. Although my friends who are in the book are not looking like Shaista, they're wearing full niqabs, most of them. And most of the women that I'm writing about are Arab women in Britain and in America, mostly from very highly educated families of an Islamist bent. And they have been some of the people who've been most oppressed by the war on terror in exactly the same way as Nadje's outlined about what's happened to women in Iraq in the ghastly trajectory of the last 10 years. And I actually did a gig in Whitechapel the night before last, which includes several of the women who are in the book actually came, and a lot of women from the area. And I said, you know, usually when I do a presentation of my book, I have to ask how many people have first-hand experience of the war on terror. But I'm not going to ask this here. And everybody laughed, because if you are a veiled Muslim woman in the East End of London, your experience of the war on terror is very close. And everybody knows people who've been arrested or had people in their family arrested, and all the things that have happened in Britain and in different ways in America associated with the war on terror. And what these women were saying to me is, how can it be that more women like you who call themselves feminists are not interested in finding out about us, talking to us, doing things with us? And I took that really to heart, because I know how very difficult it is for me to interest many of my friends, my Western friends, in what has happened to Arab women in Britain. I just say Arab in particular because that's the focus of my book. And so, like Nadje, I think it's really important for all of us who come together. We have a kind of comfort zone, as a lot of us, I think, of feminists, of what we think we all agree on, and we don't much like going beyond that. And I think it's brilliant that Ahdaf has organized this session in a way that I think allows us to be more open-minded and look at different areas that feminists can be associated with than we've really done much before. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. That's very, very to the point. And it is exactly right, that it seems to me that there is a whole area, that an area of a way of looking at what feminism is about. What does it really stand for, and what does it stand for, and how can it be most useful to most women, and how can it be an idea or a force to actually, which is what it's doing, but in sort of small pockets, to bring people together rather than to be yet another divisive. So I think that completely, I agree with Nadje, where the issue is not where you're from, it's not whether you are an Iraqi woman or an American woman. The issue is where you stand on very specific and very important questions, which is, of course, also what Victoria is talking about. So, Shereen, to bring you in here, I think that this question of feminism being an issue of where you stand on or being questioned where you stand on specific issues is really important, and also of its relationship to politics, as it were. Do you want to?
Well, I'm coming at this issue from a slightly different perspective, because I've spent 5 years traveling across the Arab world talking to people about sex. What they do, what they don't, what they think, and why. And I know this may sound like a dream job or possibly a highly dubious occupation. It depends on your viewpoint. The reason I did it, so we can ground ourselves in this, it's from a personal and professional perspective. So, as Ahdaf said, my background is from Egypt. My father is Egyptian. My family is in Egypt. I have an Egyptian passport. I'm Muslim, but I grew up in Canada. And so I didn't really think about my Arab heritage until September 11th. And that changed everything for me. And I wanted to understand where I came from. And so that's how I became interested in the Arab region. That I chose sex as my lens is my background as an immunologist and my interest and my work on HIV. And if you're going to look at HIV, particularly in the Arab region, you have to look at sex because the majority of cases of HIV have been sexually transmitted. And let me tell you, from my work with women living with HIV across the region, it hits them very, very hard. But the point is, when you look at sex, in the context of public health, it actually leads you into a much broader examination of sexuality and understanding beliefs and values and attitudes and behaviors. It's not just about the miniature of people's intimate lives. It actually allows you to examine the politics and the economics and religion and tradition and gender and generations. It all comes into play. Now, what's interesting, in the course of the 5 years, talking to over 100 people from all walks of life, feminism only came up in my discussions twice. Although sexuality, sexual rights are integral to achieving the goals of equality and women's rights. And yet this was not something that was really the most traditional women's rights groups, and we can talk about there's a newer generation of women's rights groups, but most traditional feminist groups in the region don't want to touch sexuality with a barge pole. And if they do touch on sexual issues, they conceptualize them as a problem. So it's sexual violence, for example, or female genital mutilation, for example. But talking about sex as a source of pleasure, as a source of empowerment for women, a source of creativity, this is not something they want to touch. Well, I mean, it's interesting, why don't they touch it? And I think this is coming to your point, which is, although there's a long history, as you know, in Egypt of an indigenous, women's rights movement, very strong, I think over recent decades, and certainly in the years of the Mubarak regime, a lot of these groups became associated with state feminism. And frankly, I think it affected their credibility as well with women on the ground. So, for example, one of these issues that one comes across, a lot of the more traditional established women's rights groups have come out very strongly against female genital mutilation. Absolutely, I mean, the right thing to do. We need to eliminate the practice. However, their job was made so much more difficult because of, for example, the very good law we have in Egypt, which criminalizes FGM. But because that law was pushed by the Mubarak regime, and in particular the First Lady, and was associated with a government which was frankly unrepresentative of the people's interests, I met a lot of women, for example, who were circumcising their girls as a form of resistance to the government. And so traditional women's rights groups, I think, have had a problem connecting to the grassroots and have not wanted to exacerbate that problem by touching on the taboo issue of sexuality. But what's interesting, and Nadje has firsthand experience of this as well, is that there is a new generation of feminist groups like Nasawiyya in Lebanon, Nazra in Egypt, exciting things happening on the internet. Intifadat al-Mar'a, for example, this Facebook site, The Uprising of Arab Women, which has over 100,000 followers. And they are actually starting to talk about sexuality in a positive way. And I think that's a very encouraging step forward, but it's going to take a very long time for this to enter into the mainstream discourse.
So could I ask you, because I myself am confused on this issue. When you say that that women's NGOs, credible ones, if they if they talk about sexuality, they talk about the problems, as in violence and so on, rather than talking about it as empowerment or pleasure. I mean, why would an NGO talk about it as empowerment or pleasure? What would be the, and also, what do you think of, I mean, NGOs act to be activist, and therefore they sort of go against things. Now, okay, what would you say to a general position that said that that there's no problem with a woman's right to pleasure in the Muslim world, within the context of marriage, because that is supposed to be a right. It is an inherent right. It's a husband's duty to provide pleasure. Now, of course, we know that. I mean, we know about faking it and all the rest of it. Yeah, sure.
A universal phenomenon,
yeah,
I think.
But in theory, the position is that you can go to court and demand a divorce because of lack of sexual pleasure. So that's kind of the official position, and the corollary, or the friend of that, is that our issues are so massive and are so. I mean, the woman who has to go out and sell vegetables on the sidewalk in order to try and feed her children because her husband, is dead or now has diabetes or is so broken that he can't work and so on. Does she want to know about? Do you see what I mean? That there are sort of bigger and more unifying problems that women need to deal with.
See, I don't think sexual rights, achieving sexual rights, is like a cherry on a cake that we achieve all other rights and then we get around to achieving justice and freedom and dignity and equality in our intimate lives. They mirror each other. If women don't feel able to control their own bodies, how are they going to be able to fully participate in economic, social, and political life? If we don't trust young people with the information to understand their own bodies, to be able to live fulfilled, satisfying sexual lives, how are we going to fully engage them as citizens? They're connected. I think the point, what I'm talking about is not that they should come out and say, a women's right to orgasm. Although, quite frankly, that is embedded in Islam. I mean, we have a long... Yeah, Islam is now perceived as being anti-sex, but, what's funny is if you go back 100 or 150 years, it was completely the reverse.
It was the debauchery, the religion of debauchery.
Exactly, and in fact, the Prophet Muhammad spoke so extensively and in such detail and really with such, humanity about sexual issues and the importance of sexual pleasure for both men and women, that medieval Christian commentators use this as an attack on Islam. How can this man possibly be a prophet if he is so sexed up? What I'm talking about is really engaging sexuality when it's embraced by mainstream, the traditional women's rights groups in Egypt or across the region, is conceptualized as negative rights. The freedom from coercion, the freedom from discrimination, the freedom from violence. I think we need to move this forward and talk about positive rights. A woman's right to access information about sexuality. A woman's right to express her ideas and beliefs about sexuality. A woman's right to the tools to control her own body. 1.7 million women in the Arab... There are 1.7 million unsafe abortions in the Arab region. Abortion is highly restricted in most countries. And what's interesting, actually, is that abortion laws are more of a relic of the colonial period than they are about indigenous attitudes. If you look in Islamic jurisprudence before 120 days of pregnancy, there is a wide variety of interpretations, from forbidding abortion altogether to permitting it on a wide range of grounds. We have gravitated on abortion, but on so many issues in sexuality towards the narrowest interpretation, whereas there have been times in the past where there have been much more open interpretations. And that's what I'm talking about, really, engaging in some of these positive rights, which are essential to women's well-being, and quite frankly, I believe essential to achieving all these goals, as you said, that we want to see in the political and economic sphere. What happens in the bedroom affects what happens outside the bedroom.
And the other way around as well.
Exactly, exactly.
Nadje.
I just want to very quickly sort of come in here. I agree, but at the same time, I think the problem for me is, and that is why I feel very strongly we have to get out of this Western, Middle Eastern kind of dichotomy, because we know that even those feminists, even those of the older generation who would want to do that, because of the fact that feminists in the region are always being discredited of aping the West, it is just there's no space for them to actually do that. That's why so many are terrified to speak about sexuality, about challenging also homophobia and speaking about homosexuality as well. And I also disagree that, when I was in Egypt and in the 90s and I worked with Egyptian women's rights activists, many of them were not linked to the state, were resisting the state. But they're still now today discredited of having been too close to the state. So I think there is a problem of always using either being too close to the West or being too close to the state to discredit women's rights activists, which really then makes them so super careful in what they say, which is a real problem.
But I think, that this is actually, that is an argument that's being had, but I think that there are a lot of women who are finding it very possible to be feminist and to find a feminist path that does not open them to being called sort of spokespeople for the West or following in Western traditions, and who also have had such a history that they can't be accused of having been close to the old regime. There are people like Raouf Azzat, for example. Obviously, that would be the one I would mention. Or there are people who, although they don't kind of campaign on a feminist ticket, yet they are such obvious feminists and role models for feminists like Noha Zini. There are many. So there isn't, I really don't feel that now there is a global or even a very general condemnation of activist feminist women as being too closely allied to the West, because in fact they're not.
Well, they are certainly in Iraq, and I think that I also see it in other countries, and I think the other problem is that you mentioned Raouf Azzat, who is an Islamist, and I think the problem is that, so if you're clearly sort of an Islamic feminist, you're authentic, you're good, while there's a strong history also of secular feminism in the region. So, I actually think that there is a problem in that women are discredited. And in the West, actually, people do the same thing. They say, oh, this is not authentic, and this is authentic, and Heba is authentic, and the other woman, she is actually not authentic. We do it. We are complicit. And the Western media is complicit when they speak about, these are kind of authentic traditions, and, these are closely associated with the West.
Okay, I'm feeling my way towards something which is really, it's quite subtle and quite difficult, and so this is not a kind of finished statement, but I feel that there are a lot of women, I'm talking about Egypt right now, that there are a lot of women who are feminists in their beliefs and in the way they conduct their lives, but whose work is, whose activism is to do with other issues, because those are the issues that are extremely pressing. So I'm thinking of somebody like Aida Saif al-Dawla and her work with Nadim. This is sort of, working with victims of torture and being incredibly brave in taking on the police and so on. Or Monamina, whose work is with the Syndicate of Doctors, or even somebody like my sister, who is a founder of Kifaya and the founder of... So they are not overtly, it's not their life's work to promote women's rights. But because they promote human rights very strongly, and because of the way that they conduct themselves in a feminist way, they are, I would say, very much a part of what I would call a feminist movement in Egypt today.
Definitely. Ida's a good friend of mine, but Ida in the 90s and her friends were accused of being too Western because she mentioned gender-based violence for the first time.
Sure, but that's in the 90s, and this is a very
It's a different time, and I think that Egypt is also actually quite different from, Palestine or, Iraq. So I think that's another thing. We cannot generalize, actually. The Middle East is very heterogeneous. They're very different. Lebanon is totally different, and the kind of spaces that are... And in a country that's under direct occupation like Palestine or Iraq, you would have a very different context. So I think that's important.
Okay, yeah, because when there... Okay, no, I'm the moderator, so I'm now going to shut up. So, if you would like to be thinking of how you would like to come in, and meanwhile, I'm going to ask Shaista to give us her take on all this stuff that's been...
Small job, Ahdaf, small job. Well,
you can have 5 minutes, not 4.
Thank you. That's very kind of you. What can I say? I've spent the last 10 years, 12 years traveling all over the region, from Iraq to Syria to Lebanon, Palestine, Pakistan. And, for me, I'm a proud feminist. I'm a practicing Muslim. For me, feminism is part of my identity. But I really don't like the labels that people attach when they see me. They have stereotypes of who I am. They always seem to know who I am before I've even tried to give them an idea of who I am. For some reason, I become a weather map for lots of people. So lots of people spend a lot of time doing this to me because of my hijab. I was in South Sudan in November, working in the capital in Juba, and I basically work with an aid agency. And my colleagues, my white European colleagues, spent 5 days just doing this and asking me continuously if I felt hot because of my headscarf. And I was like, no, I'm not going for the menopause yet. I'm okay. I'm not overheating. People are constantly, everything about me is defined by my choice of clothing. Nobody ever wants to know, where did you go to school? Where did you go to university? Have you traveled? None of that. It all just basically always comes down to my hijab, the color, the style of it. I'm too Western because it's bright, bright color, etc., etc. And it just gets really, really boring after a while. And actually, I think what I found most interesting is the level of hostility that I get actually from Muslim women and Arab women who don't like the hijab as well. And this is just because we might all have, we're kind of different shades of brown, right? Doesn't mean we all think the same. I worked with a woman, a Tunisian woman, who refused to even look at me for about 3 months. And then we were in a meeting, and this is exactly what happened. She leant over and she said, I'm sorry we haven't had a chance to speak just yet. I said, no problem. She said, I've heard you've got a very good sense of humor. To which I said, it's like saying to a blonde woman, I've heard you've got a brain. I was like, what are you talking about? Because, basically, everything about me is defined by my choice of clothing and, how I choose to reflect my identity. And I find that quite staggering. I've just got back from Pakistan. I was in Pakistan for 3 weeks. We talk about, feminism in action. I went to Quetta, where sadly there's a lot of bombs going off in Quetta. There's an upsurge in violence and attacks on minorities. And I met the most incredible women, doctors, who basically tell me that they risk their lives every day to leave their homes to go to this hospital, a pediatric hospital, to help women and help their babies. And that, for me, is what feminism is about. That is the strength of women. And all over the world, whenever I meet women, they tell me the most remarkable stories. And I think one of the reasons why they tell me is because I look like them. I don't share the same reality as them, but they kind of feel that they can just tell me, and I accept and take on face value what they've told me. And I think that actually is what the sisterhood is about for me. And I just wanted to quickly talk about stand-up comedy, because clearly I look like a stand-up comedian, right? And I started doing comedy about almost 2 years ago, and I used to think that our country was very multicultural and, everybody mingles and all the rest of it, until I started doing comedy, and the reaction to an hijabbed woman coming on stage is like shock and awe minus the carpet bombing. It's absolutely incredible. It's just, I was completely thrown by the reaction. And actually, some of it's from my fellow stand-ups, most of them are men, quite young. They just want to crack jokes about date rape, etc. And then I show up, and they're completely and totally uncomfortable. And then they start sweating and getting anxious. And like I said, it's just really opened up a whole new world for me, and a whole kind of really, it's just thrown me. I've just really never knew how people thought, and basically how controversial it is for a Muslim hijab woman with an opinion to take a microphone and stand on stage. It's just quite incredible.
So what kind, yeah, please.
I just want to say something about the first time I met Shaista. I didn't realize she was inexperienced stand-up at the time. I just thought she was the bravest person I'd ever seen. And I was at a table with 7 bearded men. And when she came on, I can tell you, the atmosphere at the table was like...
They were former Guantanamo prisoners, is right?
I wasn't going to go there, but anyway. Okay. But by the end of the day, the evening rather, they were so impressed. And I think that the way that she uses her skills and herself to open people's eyes is what I think all of us are really kind of striving towards. We don't want to be in some little corner called Western feminists or Egyptian feminists or something. Her way of being is the best kind of feminism, which is universal. So I just wanted to give her that wee plug.
Well, I mean, basically, I don't walk around thinking, oh, you know, today I'm going to make people change their minds about what a Muslim woman is. I mean, I think most of us, you know, just go about trying to get on with our daily lives, don't we? You know, but I must say, I do. You know, I've worked as a journalist, I've travelled all over the world, but this whole comedy thing has completely made me really, really understand how, you know, we need to listen to each other more. We need to actually we need to listen, and we need to engage with each other more. And we need to stop thinking that we know, you know, we need to stop putting labels on people, basically, because, you know, it's wrong, so.
Right. Okay, what do we have from the floor? Great. Okay, there's one here, one there. Do people have mics, or are you just going to go for it? Okay.
Shall I go?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much for speaking. It's been really, really interesting. I really enjoy what you've been saying about the dichotomy between Western feminists and Middle Eastern feminists and getting boxed into that kind of, that split. And I've got kind of a question that sort of merges into how you think we can break that dichotomy. Because I think, like you were saying, I think Middle Eastern feminist movements often get suppressed by people who box them into being, you know, aligned with old regimes. And equally, I'm trying to break into journalism, and I find it very difficult as a Western woman to talk about the Middle East because I'm very against the idea that we should be saying, oh, we need to help them. I think it's very patronizing. But I find that really difficult because the Western press do that all the time, and they're not ready for someone to come and say, I'm not happy to say, I want to help and be patronizing. So yeah, how do you think we can work to break that dichotomy and work together as women who will want the same aims?
Could you? Well, I used to be a journalist, but I mean, I am still really. It's very, very hard, and there is no magic answer. But I think that a bit what I said about Shaista and what we've all said is that it's in our individual practice and our group practice that we get people to see things differently. And the more you try to interact with journalists by writing cross letters, by going on radios, by writing in local newspapers, gradually, you erode things and you get people to wake up and change things. Actually, I'll just quickly tell you, I am very much against the normal thing I do. I was asked if I would write for a magazine I'd never heard of called Stylist. Maybe some people know about Stylist. I didn't, but my daughter said, yeah, Mum, you should do it. Because what they wanted me to write, they wanted me to write some profiles of Iraqi women 10 years on. And I have various Iraqi, very distinguished filmmakers, academics. So I did my little interviews with them. And it went back and forth, and, oh, this is too political. And can't we have some comments about, anecdotes about what they think and so on? It was the most maddening process, but I remained very calm. And at the end of the day, again, under the influence of my daughter, I accepted that they cut out everything that I myself had written as the introduction as much too political. And they took out 2 of my women as much too dramatic, political, whatever. But they left in 3 terrific Iraqi women. And whatever crap they've put in around this, I just think that I made this small contribution to getting really significant voices of those 3 women into a world which neither I nor they would ever have entered. So there's just a little example of how you can come out of your comfort zone and try and get to people, other women, in a different one.
We're going to have to stop. We haven't even started, but we're going to have to stop. So Shireen, Nadje, Victoria, Shaista, thank you so much for being here. Thank you, everybody, for being with us. Thank you.